Mr. Bordewich, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Nice to talk to you.
Why don't we start with your background? Where did you get started, the arc of your career so far, and what you're doing now?
Well, for many, many years, I was a journalist. I worked for magazines. I worked all over the world, in East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Europe, writing about political, economic, and cultural issues. For the last nearly 30 years, I've primarily written books, and mainly in the area of American political history between the founding and the post-Civil War period.
So why don't you tell us about the two books you focused on related to Congress, and then we can dig into more detail about Congress itself. But first, if you wouldn't mind introducing just what are those books about, what motivated them, and what was surprising about what you found.
Sure. Well, there were actually three. I wrote a book entitled The First Congress, which is a book about the first Constitutional Congress, which opened in 1789, the first Congress of the constitutional system. Oddly enough, though it was a watershed Congress, arguably the most important in American history because it shaped what would come afterward. Everything it did set a precedent. It's been oddly ignored on the whole by historians. I wrote a book also called America's Great Debate, which is about the long debate, the longest single debate, ongoing debate in American political history, leading up to the Compromise of 1850. Another piece of history which probably has not had its due, generally speaking, in its treatment by historians. The country was very close to civil war in 1850, closer than most people imagine. Southern states had made it clear, some of them, that they were ready to go out of the Union over slavery. War didn't occur in 1850, fortunately, because of this extraordinarily complex compromise that was engineered in Congress. If civil war had come, or secession had come, let's say, in 1850, it's highly unlikely the North would have been willing to fight the war. It was not prepared to fight a war. It was not the same as the situation in 1861. So it's a fascinating window into the workings of Congress, the 19th century Congress, at its most creative. One can argue about the particulars of the Compromise of 1850, but it was a brilliant achievement of statesmanship. And more recently, I wrote a book called Congress at War, which is about Congress during the Civil War, and arguing, or making evident, I should say, I don't think it required much argument really, that Congress's actions during the war were a fundamental component of the Union war effort. There's a tendency, I think, of Americans to credit Lincoln with making all the significant political decisions that occurred during the war, when in fact he was often following Congress, or to some degree working in tandem with Congress, not to take anything away from Abraham Lincoln, majestic as a president as he turned out to be. But the war couldn't have been fought without Congress, and particularly without the radicals in Congress who drove the war effort forward. And again, it's a book about Congress working, I would argue, at its best. And that's, when I say at its best, I don't mean that everybody in it was brilliant and equally committed to the war effort. Far from that. There was a great deal of combat and dissension within the Congress, even with the southern states out of it. But the Congress, two Congresses of the Civil War, were extremely productive. And that's what I mean by Congress working at its best. And in that sense, the Civil War Congresses are very similar in some ways to the first Congress, which was extremely productive. And I'm interested in seeing Congress at work. I think in recent generations, we've lost sight of how critical Congress is to governing, in that, at least in our popular culture, we tend to think of the president or the presidency as the main locus of power, and presidential elections as the important one, and congressional elections as kind of somewhat of a sideshow. But in fact, as you well know, we have three branches of government, and the founders, if anything, thought that Congress was the most powerful, and were much more interested in reining in the power of Congress because they thought the presidency was far too weak. So at any rate, all these books and other things that I've written focus on the machinery of Congress at work, but in a narrative form. I'm not a political scientist, I'm an historian. I'm interested in seeing how individuals, the great and the not so great, the mediocre and even the less than mediocre, actually functioned within Congress. And how did it produce legislation that really mattered?
Well, that's an interesting notion of the individual compared to the system, right? Which Congress was set up as a system, and then you have these individuals working within it. And as a historian, you've mentioned that you focus on the individuals. So it's an interesting, and with Congress as an institution, they're working within a certain framework, right? And so I'm very curious, particularly as it relates to the first Congress, when really a lot of the ground rules were being set. You know, when you started off on that book, you know, did it get to where you thought it was going to be? What was surprising along the way as you did the research and as you made the tale?
Well, I think the most surprising aspect of the first Congress was that it actually worked. We have to remember that the system we have now, the constitutional system that was set up, was Plan B. It was not Plan A. Plan A was the Articles of Confederation, which was a flop, that system, which the country tried for roughly a decade, and it failed miserably. And only then, and on the part of many of the founders reluctantly, was the Constitution crafted. And the Constitution didn't actually create anything. The Constitution is a piece of paper with a bunch of ideas, a framework. The Congress, the first Congress that came out of the Constitution, had the job of actually turning the ideas of the Constitution into a system of government, into institutions. While George Washington was groping towards some idea of what the presidency could be or should be, Congress was actually figuring out what it should be and what it can do and what the various provisions of the Constitution might mean as the machinery of government. And then, of course, we have the judiciary, which was, frankly, fairly trivial. At the beginning, it was quite some while before the Supreme Court took on the dimensions that it has today. James Madison, as you know, was probably the single most dynamic figure at the beginning of the first Congress, as he was in the Constitutional Convention. And at least at the beginning of the first Congress, almost everybody would turn to Madison and say, well, Jimmy, what did you mean by this? Because he was regarded as the foremost interpreter of what the Constitution was supposed to mean, because he wrote a lot of it. Okay. But Madison was close to a nervous breakdown in the spring of 1789, when Congress was about to meet for the first time in New York City, which was our first capital, because people weren't showing up. Madison didn't know whether Congress would actually work, whether the machine of government would run. And if you read his letters to his men who become his fellow members of Congress, he said, please hurry, there's nobody here. And there were fears not only on Madison's part, but on part of many of the founders about whether Congress would be able to function, because the Articles of Confederation had failed. Failure was the track record so far. And yet here we are, more than 200 years later, and it with this massive structure of government and Congress with vast responsibilities for a population that was beyond imagining in 1789, a size that was beyond imagining. And from this little flickering spark of 1789. So when I put myself into the shoes of those individuals like Madison, their letters are marvelous. There are copious letters written by the founders, and was able to share their anxieties. They couldn't see the future. They couldn't see 6 months down the road, much less 10 years or 200 years. They had hopes and aspirations, but very little confidence.
So, one of the things I think would be very exciting about our discussion today is that you're coming with this historian's mind and eye, right? And a lot of the, contemporary issues or issues over the long run, I think you can bring some context to them, or at least I'm hoping so. And so I have a number of different areas I'd like to go through. And maybe the first one, since you mentioned Madison, this concept of faction, right? Now, faction, in my mind, is a broadly defined concept, right? Anything from two people to a party, to the South or the North, to a special interests. When you think about the concept of faction as the founders envisioned it, or at least Madison thought about it, how has that worked out over time? And do you think that the safeguards that are in the structure of the Constitution work? And then I guess the second part of that is whether there need to be additional safeguards within the Congress itself around this notion of faction.
Well, the word faction was a dark and dirty word in the late 18th century. Factionalism approximated the idea of selfishness and the absence of public or common interest, and was therefore something to fear in government. Most of the founders hoped, and the praying ones prayed, they weren't all prayers, prayed that there would be no political parties, that men elected to office would have an almost Platonic sense of the public good and act on that larger sense of public good. These were hopes. They knew human beings. Madison actually was very hard-headed about what human beings were like. And I think we should disabuse ourselves of any idea that there was a kind of broad, hopeful consensus of that the new system was good and that there was a common interest. Indeed, sectionalism in the early republic was savage. New Englanders distrusted or hated Southerners. Westerners distrusted New Englanders. Southerners had their own biases, and sometimes it was from state to state to a degree that would make today's partisans blanch. So that's the reality on the ground. That there were economic interests, whether it's slavery in the South, protecting slavery, very significant factor, fostering shipping in the North, not one of today's main political interests, but it certainly was in the early republic, and many other economic concerns of that type, often bearing on an issue, or rather not a very sexy issue, of course, tariffs and protectionism and things of that sort, but very hot at the time and throughout most of American history, for that matter. You can see that competition at work, even in the first Congress, even at the beginning. I mean, Madison understood, and he makes it clear in the Federalist Papers, makes it clear that human beings, political people, have divergent views, divergent interests that are going to conflict with each other. And I mean, a fundamental part of the concept that became the United States government was that people would be at odds with each other, that they would compete with each other, that they would fight each other. Now, I mean, of course, he hoped that this would all be comparatively civil, but often it wasn't. Even in the very first Congress, on certain issues, not civil at all. So the conflict is inbuilt in the system, in what Patrick Henry called this crazy machine of government. Nobody expected Congress or government to be efficient. The word doesn't even occur in any discussion bearing on government. Nobody thought it would be efficient. People thought it was imperative that people say what they had to say, identify their interests, and then come to some kind of common agreement in order to move forward, i.e. compromise. Okay. It's interesting that the founders did not, or at least the more idealistic ones, did not expect the development of political parties. Yeah, political parties formed almost, not quite instantaneously, but within a decade, in less than a decade. The Federalists, those who supported the constitutional system, and anti-Federalists who hated the constitutional system, but wanted to have their skin in the game anyway, who evolve approximately into the early so-called Republican Democratic Party, Jefferson's party, and so on. And Federalists fade away, as we know, and their approximate heirs become, decades later, the Whigs, Republicans, and so on. But those who thought political parties would not form, who believed that individuals would transcend factionalism, were wrong. They were wrong. And the history of 200 plus years demonstrates that. And a very interesting political man of the Civil War era, William Pitt Fessenden, a senator from Maine, head of the Finance Committee at the time. I've written about him at length. He's forgotten by most people, but he was a great power in his day. He was at the more conservative end of the Republican Party, which was the progressive party of its day. Okay. Fessenden, who had no patience for fools, and would become very irritated at prolonged debates during the Civil War era, and when he was in a position to try to put an end to them in order to get some legislation done. Sounds familiar. Fessenden said, nonetheless, that there's no quiet except in a tyranny. In other words, he was saying we will always be half at each other's throats. That's democracy or Republican government at work. So I think this is competition, partisanship, conflict is part of our machine. Is part of our machine. We will not scrub it out except at the price of losing something that's essential to democracy. So perfecting the way Congress works or the functioning of American government doesn't mean scrubbing away partisanship, but governing, factoring it in, and governing in spite of it by finding ways to enhance commonality of interest, given the fact that nobody's ever going to agree.
Well, one of the questions I have related to Madison's or, historical figures' notion of faction relates to this concept of control. So on the one side, you could have a faction of people who all believed the same thing, right? And voted in lockstep just because of their common value framework, right? On the other hand, you could have a group of people who had a leader, and that leader is telling them how to vote on various things, right? So it's the magnification or it's external control of a member by someone else. So are those two things distinct in your mind when you're thinking about the founding era and how they came up with this concept of faction, this notion of external control? Was that an issue for Madison, or was it all just kind of under one umbrella term, faction? It could have gone either way for whatever reason.
Well, interestingly, the founders, Madison, we're talking about Madison, I guess, certainly knew what a demagoguery was. They knew what it was. They feared it as a phenomenon. And indeed, by spreading power out, whether among the voting public, House of Representatives, or the states, Senate structure, and so on, by diffusing power, they hope to preclude the possibility of a demagogue becoming strong enough to certainly dominate the government. They were thinking of the government as a whole. And when they thought demagogue, they were thinking of the demagogues of the Roman Republic. And then also of a monarch. The word monarchism often pops up in debate in the early Congresses. People, of course, remembered the king, although the king was not inherently a demagogue, but they certainly feared the centralization of power in any one person. But they knew what a popular demagogue was, and they certainly feared it. Did they see it? Did they see it in the early Congresses? No. You did. There are no demagogues in the first Congresses. In fact, I think you don't really see charismatic public leadership, political leadership in Congress until, and this is only arguably, the era of Henry Clay, say, who was charismatic. To some extent, Webster, somewhat less so. Andrew Jackson, certainly, although Jackson, of course, was president. He wasn't a congressional leader. So this is 2 generations later, arguably from 3 generations later. And I think it's perhaps striking that you do not see demagoguery at the beginning. Politics isn't really a mass phenomenon in the very early republic. In many states, hardly anybody got to vote. I mean, it was only not just all white men, but only some white men. And indeed, the first several decades of the republic sees a gradual, in fact, one can say most of American history describes a steady, gradual widening of the right to vote. But at the beginning, almost everybody in Congress, House and Senate would be from a comparatively elite background. They do vary. I mean, we shouldn't imagine just aristocrats and rich businessmen. There's a lot more diversity than that, but nonetheless, demagoguery in American politics really only develops when we have mass politics in the 19th century, and it becomes a possibility where you have lots of people who are maybe more swayed by a personality than by, dare I say, principles and interests. Not always the same thing, of course.
Right. So what about the notion then of privacy versus transparency? You know, this is something, you know, I'm quite interested in. On the one side, you know, there's the notion of a transparent utopia where you can see everything inside Congress that happens every minute, and maybe even see into the thoughts of all of the senators and congressmen. And I think some people would think that that was a good thing. And then, you know, then there's the opposite case, pretty much, which is the Constitution itself was, you know, locked up in a building and came out with a document that worked for 200 years. So where do you think the founders sort of came out on this notion of transparency? What's its role? Where should it be? Where should it not be? You know, and given where we are now, is it, you know, you've seen a lot of backroom deal, you know, you've done work on those. Are they better? Are they worse? Should it be out in the open? What's your perspective on this concept of transparency when it comes to Congress?
Yeah, this is an interesting contemporary problem. You know, one, I want to begin by saying the word transparency is an anachronism if we try to apply it to the early republic, because the word was never used. Okay, though it's a pretty valid thing for us to be talking about today with our capacity to through modern technology and so on, as well as, you know, a democratized principle of openness, which is far beyond what the founders actually hewed to. That said, it came up in other language in the early republic. How so? Well, on one hand, the constitutional system provided for extremely open government. The House of Representatives was the best show in town for visitors in New York City. They packed into the visitors galleries. And indeed, that was true for American government until modern times. Certainly through the 19th century. I mean, if you were going to Washington, you went and you sat for hours at a time listening to the debates in Congress. Partly that was because there really were debates in Congress. There was something to see and hear, not an empty floor. Okay. So House debates were open, they were recorded, people discussed them, and the Senate was something different. The Senate not only was closed, Senate debates were closed, but in addition, members of the Senate were not permitted to record the debates. They were not permitted to keep diaries of the debates. The press did not cover the Senate. It was essentially a closed room. Bear in mind, the numbers are tiny. There were only, well, first 11, then 13, then a couple of more states. We're only talking about a very small number of men in one small room. Now, thanks to a long forgotten member of the Senate, William McClay of Pennsylvania, who thwarted the rules and kept a diary, we actually have a pretty good record, highly biased, but nonetheless, a pretty detailed record of what the Senate did talk about, so we know what it was like. In addition, many members wrote letters home about what was going on, so it's not totally invisible. But here you have the founders coming down on both sides of that argument about transparency. The House, pretty transparent, given the logistics of the time. I mean, very, very well covered by the press and so on. And the Senate, no transparency whatsoever, totally opaque, or at least in principle. Now, given Americans' tenacious concept and deepening concept of democracy, which means it's our government, you can't do anything behind closed doors. I mean, this idea in some form exists even in those early days. The Senate finally had to open up. It kept a daily record, and by the 19th century, the Senate's debates are open as well. Now, Yeah, there were also a lot of back rooms. A lot of work got done in back rooms. In the first Congress, a lot of that work got done in taverns, in the back rooms of taverns, where members hung out, or in the parlors of members, where small groups would get together. And famously, most famously, the country's first important backroom deal, literally taking place in Thomas Jefferson's dining room. Jefferson was Secretary of State at the time, but at any rate, you have Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton sitting around a table doing a deal, and that deal involves the South being willing to trade a few votes to approve Alexander Hamilton's brilliant, far-reaching debt stabilization plan for the United States, in return for Hamilton corralling enough northern votes to enable the capital of the United States, the permanent capital, to be placed securely within the slave states on the Potomac River. One could say this was a cynical deal. On the other hand, one could say it was a brilliant deal. It was both. If we look at this from a more contemporary point of view, I think radical transparency is, I think given modern technology and the right kind of legislation, it's possible, but I think it could be crippling for government. I think it's imperative that members of government be able to negotiate without being in the glare, the spotlight.
So where do you think transparency should fall out today, given what you know from history, from the early days, even through the Civil War? Do you think that there needs to be places for these backroom deals to happen, or should we have an open trading floor on where everyone can see every trade that happens between members?
Yeah, I think just because we aspire to the idea of complete openness and transparency doesn't necessarily mean it's a great idea. And I think it's potentially crippling for the process of government, in that there has to be room for members of government, members of Congress, to advance ideas, spontaneous ideas, perhaps, that may not be popular. Today we clearly live in a country with a vast number of Americans who are in who are in have an attitude of perennial irritation and frustration with government, and who believe, I think terribly destructively so, that government somehow is bad or predatory, not working in their interests, that's completely owned by special interests. All these ideas are, I think, dangerous to democracy, by the way. One of the things that has most struck me in writing about American government in earlier times was the tremendous pride that Americans took in their government, and all the flaws that we may see in today's Congress or government existed from the beginning to some degree. Even the government was far smaller and the country was far smaller. All the same things, whether it range from ideas about corruption or inefficiency or gridlock, and so on and so on. Yet Americans had a tremendous pride. They knew that the government they had was, and it was from generations, unique in the world, and that with all its flaws, it functioned pretty well. And I think the collapse of confidence in government and Congress is very damaging. It's seriously damaging, and I think this is more a cultural problem than I think it is inherently a political problem. I don't think the solution is really just improving the mechanics of government, although, yes.
And you think that's related to transparency in some way?
Well, okay. Radical transparency, as I think I said, potentially can be crippling. Members need to be able to talk about things that aren't popular, that could irritate their own constituencies or other constituencies. And frankly, they need to be able to cut deals. Compromise is about cutting deals, let's be blunt about it. Whether it was the Great Compromise, 1790 that we talked about earlier in Jefferson's back room, or the Great Compromise of 1850 that resulted in staving off civil war at that time, which had both a cynical dimension in that certain parts of that compromise were morally questionable, but politically imperative. And I think government has to make decisions like that. And it's not a sphere where moral purism flourishes. Moral purism is a ball and chain on government. And it's not as if there are only two alternatives: corruption and tyranny on one end, and enlightened commonality on the other. Most of government takes place right in the middle. And compromise, I should say also, in the end, it tends to leave everybody kind of unhappy. I think there's a notion compromise would leave people feeling good. Well, often not at all, because nobody gets everything he wants. So to some degree, at least, the process that leads to compromise needs to be able to take place, I think, outside the glare of the 24-hour news cycle. So I'm not a fan of radical transparency.
What about the notion of delegating authority? So, I think it was in your first Congress book where you talk about, the first, at least the early Congresses, they could be very specific in the bills, up to, I think I recall something about where a tree is planted or something on the grounds, where basically micromanaging every element of the action they wanted executed, right? Whereas, today we have, and for 100 years, I guess, we've had delegation of major rulemaking authority. Where would the first Congress come out on that? Would they say, look, that was a power they never should have given away, it should be in Congress, every rule, every law? Or would they understand the situation and think that delegation was legit?
Yeah, I think that by and large, these men were pretty pragmatic. They were pretty pragmatic. An interesting, at least to those of us who may be looking at Congress in a microscopic way, an interesting debate was over the size of congressional districts. And there were very contentious debates over whether the size should be 30,000 people or 40,000. That's way back in our rearview mirror today. And they understood that the country was going to grow. They didn't foresee the present size, but nonetheless, they knew it was going to grow. Districts were going to get big, had to get bigger. And that, let's call it the intimacy of early government would be lost. They understood that the country would evolve in that direction. Some tried to stave it off. Others said this is the way it will be. So bear in mind that at the beginning, there was almost no government. The federal government employed almost nobody. I think the Treasury Department was the largest of the 4 departments, and I believe it employed 7 people. The Department of State, that was Jefferson and a clerk. So A little later, the postal department is established, and most federal employees are postmasters. There are customs houses employ a few people. So the size of the government is tiny, There isn't really anything much to delegate at that point. But I think the process that we see through history describes the realism of legislators doing what needs to be done, given the especially from the late 19th century on, and then the 20th century, exponentially increasing size of government. I mean, not even the most conservative originalists of today who want to shrink government think we should go back to a Treasury Department with 7 people in it and a State Department with 2. It's beyond imagining.
But it sounds like, in theory, you could have the regulatory bodies report to Congress directly, right, instead of the executive. And it sounds like you think that the founders would have gone with the current structure of delegating that to the executive.
That's a challenging question, because it's very hard to say how they would feel about something they couldn't actually imagine in their own day. I'm personally agnostic on this, okay? The expansion of the executive department has various phases. One, and it's significant here, when you go back to the early 20th century, to those who distrusted too much democracy. That's to say, Congress, and hope to isolate executive activity, the departments, agencies, bureaus, vast proliferation of agencies from politics. And this derives from let's say, the good government movement of the late 19th century, Karl Schurz and his colleagues, who really found a lot of what we call democratic government a bit distasteful. They participated in it in their own way, but they feared corruption more than they loved democracy, so to speak. And then, of course, the executive agencies have proliferated, in our own lifetimes, or at least from the mid 20th century on. I think big government is absolutely inescapable in the modern age. It will get bigger. Our societies are more complicated. Efficiency matters. I think the one area where I think the founders kind of touched on this, but it's dangerous to try to extrapolate too much from the beginning, is that, as I said earlier, they, and I'm talking here about Madison in particular, but also his Federalist allies, felt that, if anything, more power needed to be put into the presidency, because there was no prior presidency under the Articles of Confederation. There was merely a chairman of the kind of the Committee of States, which is what it was, who had next to no power. And they feared that if tyranny were to evolve in the United States, it would come out of Congress, which is hard to imagine today, given the today's configuration of power, which is very different. Our presidency, the degree of power in today's presidency perhaps would frighten some of them, I think, particularly given recent political history in the United States. I think the person who last held the presidency would have terrified them. I think there's no question that that's what they had in mind when they feared demagoguery. And they were thinking about the demagogues of ancient Rome. It has happened now in this country. And so if I can put myself in their shoes, a dangerous thing to attempt, I think in seeing today's executive with the size and power that are reposed in it in the hands of a demagogue would have scared the wits out of them. But on the other hand, they couldn't really imagine it. As I said, I'm agnostic here. I think that we all want to see government operate more efficiently. I personally do not object to a strong presidency. I'm not a small government person. I think in the world that we live in, it's hard enough for our system to act decisively. It's very hard indeed to act decisively, and power is still so diffused. Basically a good thing, but I think a pretty good argument can be made, not that I'm going to eloquently make it, about an expansive executive being a more plausible mode of government in today's world.
So what about when we talk about decision-making, we talk about power in Congress, there's this notion of the majority, 51% or whatever, and get 1 over 50 and you're able to then enact something. There are some 2/3, thresholds. What was the discussion in the early days about what those thresholds should be? I mean, was it just everyone's, majority rule, that's it, and 2/3? Was there a lot of thought or discussion in that? Would certain kinds of bills should have 4/5? Why did they, settle down on these various, what seem relatively, majority rules is, it's tight notion for being able to create a law that would be immortal, right? Or put, or borrow against future generations. 51% is a pretty low threshold. So I'm curious, how did they approach that question in the early days about what were the thresholds needed to do things, or the quorums required? Like, was there a lot of debate on it, or they just kind of adapt it from state constitutions?
No, Madison wanted to see majority rule in the US Senate as well. He strongly advocated for it. He lost the argument, one of the few that Madison just really lost. There was a strong popular desire for popular government, hence the way the House of Representatives is organized. The compromise that produced the Senate that we know and we love or don't love was hammered out very contentiously in the Constitutional Convention because of the fears of small states, the small states of the time, at any rate, that they would have inadequate power in the new government. Bearing in mind that during the Articles of Confederation period, they voted by states, not as individuals. Each state had essentially one vote, whether Virginia, which was 13 times larger in population than the smallest state. By the way, by comparison, and I'm going to circle around to this, today the disparity is 68-1. It's California to Wyoming. The disparity is so vast in the Senate that I think any discussion of improving the way Congress operates has to address the, dare I say, the next to impossible problem of reforming the structure of the US Senate, which is so distorted today that could the founders have imagined that? Not to this degree. Okay, but perhaps we'll come back to that. So small states, the challenge at the Constitutional Convention was to stitch together a structure that everybody could agree on. And again, as I said earlier, it was a compromise, and compromises often make a lot of people unhappy. Madison was unhappy. He didn't like it, but he went along with it because he felt it was necessary to get the ship out of port, or into port, perhaps.
So really the 51%, or the majority rule concept, it sounds to me like was really more of a practical concept rather than a theoretical one, right? Just to get stuff done was really the motive, rather than 51% is a more representative than a 60% or what have you. There's none of those kind of theoretical discussions really were part of the debate. It was really what's practical, or who has the power.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I, off the top of my head, can't think of any instance in state or local government preceding the constitutional era where 2/3 was the threshold for anything. Now I may be wrong. Perhaps it was somewhere. I can't think of an example. So it was a pure compromise by giving more weight to states, to small states, and of course, we see that principle tenaciously defended even as we speak today, even in literally today's debate and debates in Congress, in the Senate, at any rate.
So what about the notion then of vetoes or delays? Obviously today, if you look at the House, you could say that a committee chairman has a veto over legislation passing through his committee. Up to a certain point, you can say that the speaker has a definite veto over legislations passing through. Maybe every senator has one. But in the Constitution, it says only the president has the veto power. So I'm curious, when you think about in the founding era, this majority rule, did that apply universally, or did they have this notion also of veto? I mean, did Madison have an effective veto in the early Congresses over legislation, and it was embedded from the very beginning, or not? How did this evolve?
No, the veto, as you're describing it, didn't even exist as a practice. I mean, one thing that really distinguishes the first Congress from later ones was the urgency of making things work, of building this government. Everybody was on board with that, even the anti-federalists who were in Congress. Elbridge Gerry, who gave his name to what we today call gerrymandering, an ardent anti-federalist, didn't like the government. But even he and like-minded men understood that they had to make it work. There was no plan C. As I said earlier, this was plan B. There was no plan C. So they had to make it work. And one sees the members of the first Congress determined to create the institutions of government, determined to legislate, determined to solve problems. For example, the very ominous burden of debt that the United States had in those early days, and so on. And the veto, as we know it, even the presidential veto, was very, very rare. Right up in well through the 19th century. The first president I can think of who vetoed with a very ardent hand was Rutherford B. Hayes, hardly on anybody's list of famous former presidents, but who repeatedly, over and over and over, he was president 1877 to 81, vetoed bills that would have demolished what remained of civil rights in the South. it's a whole other issue here. Vetoes were rare. I mean, they've today in the 20th century become, well, 20th, 21st, become much more common. Lincoln vetoed, of course. I don't mean to imply that it didn't happen. Andrew Johnson vetoed and was overridden repeatedly.
But what about the vetoes within the chamber itself? You know, these different groups inside the House or the Senate being able to block legislation, you know, effectively through either debate or through some actual rule?
Well, it's not common in the early republic. It's not common. In fact, I can't say it's non-existent, but it's not common. I'm going to come at that from the side. Okay. Historically, Congress is most efficient. It's sometimes brilliantly efficient when one party has a huge majority, and basically a veto-proof majority. There are 4 Congresses that applies to in particular, not only, but 4. The first Congress, Federalists dominated it. The Civil War era Congresses dominated by the Republicans. The Roosevelt's first New Deal Congresses and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society Congresses, where one party was sufficiently powerful that it could essentially do what it wanted and incorporated the minority's interests to a greater or lesser degree. That we're in an era of highly contentious congressional non-majorities, okay, where the balance is so close that it doesn't take much to stymie legislation. We've seen this. It's not the only period in American history when this has been the case. Much of the post-Civil War era, as the Republican power declined and Congress seesawed back and forth between Republican and Democratic control for the rest of the 19th century, from 1874 on. And it was much more difficult for Congress to legislate, as it always is, when and therefore, for whether it be a committee chairman, a powerful senator or clique of senators, such as, or powerful members, not just senators. For example, Southern segregationists within the Democratic Party for a couple of generations had veto power over all civil rights legislation for decades, and certain powerful committee chairmen, even within that caucus. You know, obviously, this is a distortion. This is a distortion of the system. It's not good. It's not inherently baked into the American system. If you look at Henry Clay and his career, his long congressional career, first in the House, then in the Senate, Clay, who's I have immense admiration for as a legislator. Okay, he was a man of another era. You can argue about his values, but as a man who actually made the machine run, he was brilliant, towering above any other. Webster, his rival, was a great orator, brilliant orator, but never the same, never embodying the same skill as a man who crafted legislation. I mean, Clay, and I think in the sense you're using the term, I don't think ever vetoed legislation, even though he was tremendously powerful. Clay had a great following, both in the larger public and within the House and Senate. But he saw his job as crafting legislation, crafting, famously, of course, compromise, of winkling out agreement, from men who disagreed with him, rather than stymieing them. He wasn't afraid of people who disagreed with him, if often profoundly. He was interested in giving them something. So I think if we look back to a model legislator, we can look back to Clay. There are others. Lyndon Johnson in more recent times, I think, is in that tradition as well. And I think there's a cultural problem here that isn't just structural, and it's a product of the extreme partisanship that we're experiencing today at a time when there are no stable majorities. I think that the will of individuals will decrease if one party or the other has a highly functional majority. And in that sense, I think that, I don't see the end of the current era. I do not know how much longer we're going to be in this. We call it gridlock. I mean, that's a contemporary term that's, you could only have once there was traffic. So of course the founders didn't use such a term, or in the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, certainly there was what we call gridlock. And I think in a way, the pre-Civil War period resembles ours in a legislative sense, in that there was gridlock over slavery. Different experiments were tried, mostly failed. We had a war. And what I see lacking in today's Congress, and I don't want to dwell on this, but is really a will to collaborate for fear of alienating the more let's say the more ardent or more zealous branches of each party. I don't want to use the word radical. I don't think it's appropriate. Both parties seem to be afraid of that at the present moment, and we see it in certain debates that are taking place in Congress today.
Well, that comes to the notion of this idea of representation, right? What does representation really mean? If you're elected, from a district, and that district is 51% of a certain party, does that mean, you're a strong partisan, or do you represent the entire district? All those people that are in the minority as well, and you need to reflect and integrate those views. Or does it mean something, altogether different? Does it mean you make your own judgments irrespective of the parties that are in your district, thinking about the long term? Or does it mean, which is my notion, which is you represent everyone who will ever live in that district. So you represent the future as well as the present. And you don't know what parties those people are going to be. So, I think the notion of representation is the issue that is the core of the issue that we're discussing here. And, I'm thinking back to when you started the conversation about that people in the first Congress, the representatives, really had this notion of getting something done for the public good, right? So it seems from your implication there is that their notion of representation meant the public good, everyone in the country over the long run. Whereas if you define representation as a narrow interest, you're going to have a very different set of incentives. So, can you talk a little bit about that and go back to that concept of representation in the early Congresses compared to what has evolved over time? Was it like that in the early days? Were they more public spirited, or were they really thinking about, they didn't have primaries back then, but the voters, who had voted them in their particular district? And did it even change within the first Congress?
Yeah, that is a really crucial question. really crucial question. Let's unpack it a bit. And it goes back right to the beginning. In one form or another, it has been perennial in American politics. And the answer to your question is kind of all of the above, sad to say. What do I mean by that? That right from the beginning, there was a difference of opinion about whether members elected to Congress were expected to vote as either the state in the Senate, if they were senators, because senators were then elected by their state legislators. Many state legislatures instructed senators to vote in a certain way on specific issues. That was true for some, many, right after the Civil War. And they diverged at their peril. There were others who might not be instructed by their state legislature. In the House, of course, they weren't, although they might be anyway. The legislature might, in fact, give a congressman instructions, even though he was elected by the voting public at large. He might or might not adhere to those instructions, but again, at his peril, he would diverge. Let's take James Madison, okay, who was the de facto Speaker of the House, although the position didn't exist then, came later. Madison came into the first Congress very much seeing himself as representing the interests of this country, of all voters, not all people necessarily, because so many didn't actually vote. But increasingly, even in the course of the first Congress, because he wanted to stay in Congress, he became what I think one might say more and more parochial in order to ensure that he'd be reelected. He barely won election in the first place, despite having authored most of the Constitution, because there were many anti-federalists in his district. So he became, in effect, less and less ardent an advocate of the constitutional system that he had in fact created. I don't want to overemphasize this point, but there you see it right from the beginning. You had individuals who saw their role. This to a degree applies even to the other generally wonderful Daniel Webster, who absolutely saw himself as a representative of the New England shipping industry. He advocated for it. There was no compromise on that, even though he was the man who thought in highly national terms. And on many issues, he was very much on the issue of slavery, for example, even though he didn't always come down where we would like. Nonetheless, he thought of it, recognized it as a national problem. So, I mean, voters want their representatives to do what they want. Now, that will never change. It will never be different, And we have term limits. They're called elections, really. If you don't satisfy your voters, you're out. Not always, but by and large. Now, I would somewhat take issue with the way you framed part of your question, which is to say, if someone wins with 50%, 51% of the vote, is he a responsible legislator if he doesn't represent his whole district? And I like the way you added to that by saying not only it's the present, but also to a degree the past and the future. I like that. I think that's a valuable way of framing it. However, we know, of course, that members of Congress or the Senate who were not elected with huge majorities, in fact, tend to be the most, at least potentially bipartisan and the least partisan. And we see examples of that in the U.S. Senate today with Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, not to dwell on them as individuals, but both of them Democrats from states with really significant conservative, in West Virginia, predominantly conservative electorates. And regardless of what one's feelings may be about those two individuals, this is how people from marginal districts, they are states, of course, not districts, tend to behave. And by far the most partisan are those from one-party districts. Now, what's the solution here? You didn't exactly ask me, but I think the increasingly refined and scientific gerrymandering of districts is absolutely disastrous. It's disastrous. There's even though it's tried and true, and it goes back to the relatively early years of the Republic, relatively early, not the beginning. It's become epidemic since the 20th century, and it's a structural problem which therefore can be remedied. It's not a cultural problem. It can be remedied with legislation, although it's very hard. You have to persuade 50 states to act on it. A certain number have. And I think, I know I'm not alone in this, that the fewer partisan districts there are, the more the legislators elected in those districts will be prone to compromise with others, because they're representing a lot of people who don't necessarily agree with their highest values. And you know, we're in an era when I think far too many Americans feel bizarrely outraged when a representative or a senator doesn't represent precisely what they hoped when they elected him or her. Just bizarre and terribly corrosive, I think, by setting unrealistic and frankly undemocratic standards for the way legislators are expected to behave. And so, you know, I'm all for any ideas that structural ideas that break down partisan gerrymandering and for whatever reasons. Sometimes that's carried out with, let's say, somewhat idealistic and moral intentions. Most often not. It's just for party advantage. And I mean, even where my own party, whichever one it is, might suffer, nonetheless, I think that's a small price to pay for a healthier Congress.
So I think you already started to answer my next question as I move into the questions I ask all of our guests, which is, what do you think congressional representation should mean? So sounds like you think they should represent everybody, potentially the future. And are you a Burkean, or are you, where do you come down on, should the member make their own judgments or just reflect the aggregate interests of their groups,
all of the above? I have to say again, I am a pragmatist. I mean, one can have high ideals. I'm not speaking of myself. I'm speaking of, I would hope that I do as well. But I'm speaking of legislators, can have high ideals and also be pragmatic. Fortunately, that describes at heart probably most legislators, even those who don't feel free to act as pragmatically as they might want to for fear of being canceled and by one side or the other, pilloried by their voters and so on. I mean, right from the beginning, legislators have wrestled with that question. And the same legislator may make a different call depending on the issue. I mean, of course, there may be an issue like Jeanette Rankin many, many years ago in the early 20th century, who was a first woman in Congress elected from Montana, interestingly, but was a pacifist. She refused to vote with the majority to declare war in 1917. And she lost office over it. Montanans didn't like it. They voted her out. She voted her conscience because it was a principle very, very deeply held. And we all can think of other examples of legislators who just do that regardless of what their constituents think. On the other hand, I think obviously representative government means the person elected is meant to represent his or her district. And the answer is going to vary from person to person, issue to issue, era to era. And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think it's not to insist otherwise is not realistic. And I mean, I lived for quite a number of years in the district of a congressman in New York State who, frankly, had values very different from mine, very different. I didn't like him very much. I voted against him, but he was comparatively pragmatic in the way he actually voted. His oratory, I found sometimes even offensive, but he was nonetheless a comparatively pragmatic legislator because it was not a single, his party did not own the district. And I think he had a somewhat larger idea of what his responsibilities were. So I've had that experience. I voted against him every time I had a chance, but nonetheless, I don't think he was an irresponsible legislator simply because he didn't represent what I would have preferred. You know, my option is to vote against him. That's built in. You know.
Right. Well, my next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? You know, and by this I mean, you know, in DC versus their home district, you know, legislating versus overseeing. How much time should you allow them for campaigning? You know, how would you break it down?
Yeah, I mean, this is a practical question. It's a bit challenging because history doesn't tell us very much on this particular subject. I mean, it used to be that when members went to the Capitol, whether it was in New York or whether it was in Philadelphia or for these 200 plus years in Washington, because of the primitive nature of transportation, they stayed there while Congress was in session. They didn't go anywhere. They couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't go home for the weekend if you were from Oregon, much less Ohio in the Civil War era. You couldn't go. You couldn't go. So these were not options until modern transportation made it possible, modern modes of communication. Similarly, there was no such thing really as what we call constituent service through much of American history. It did exist to a degree under a different name, which is to say a constituent might petition you to pass some very particular type of legislation. I mean, Congress was preoccupied in early days with innumerable what we would call petty tasks, which have now been farmed out to agencies happily. Pension. The daughter of a veteran of the War of 1812 might be petitioning for a $3 pension per month pension, and that Congress had to pass a law giving her that pension. It was, it's ridiculous in today's terms. So a great deal of Congress's time was actually kind of wasted on stuff like that in earlier times. They weren't all thinking the big thoughts and legislating on the great issues of the day. Constituent service, everybody, all Americans now expect constituent service. In other words, for the congressman or woman to represent them to the agencies and so on, represent their rights in one way or another. And that was not part of the original concept, but there it is. I mean, we're better off, the Congress people, perform this kind of work for the public than not. It's got to be factored in. I want to address something here that I think bears on how congressmen use their time. And it's a little oblique to your question, but this problem of the filibuster, okay, which is a real problem. I don't want to get deep in the weeds on it, except, I mean, I absolutely support reforming the filibuster to the extent of requiring what we refer to as a talking filibuster. In other words, members having to actually speak. I think the current situation is a scandal. It's a constitutional scandal. It's a political scandal, and I dare say it's an ethical scandal. That what we call a filibuster isn't actually a filibuster. It's a threat of a filibuster that never actually happens. It's a numbers game. And one of the things that is most striking, has been most striking to me in looking at the Congresses of eras past, particularly the first or the 19th century Congresses, is the eloquence, persuasiveness, and bluntness of debate in Congress. Debate really was debate. It really was debate. If you read in the Congressional Globe or the Congressional Record, are marvelous resources. I mean, they're challenging to read, I grant you, because it's all in 10-point type, but nonetheless, read Webster, read Clay, read the men of the Carl Schurz, men of the 19th century. They were all men in those days, debating. One, they're working their thoughts and their arguments out while they speak on the floor, often speaking for hours at a time with no notes. I don't know that any living American is capable of speaking for 4 hours cogently in grammatical paragraphs on any subject. But at any rate, in earlier times, it's very striking that members felt a duty to explain what they really thought, why they thought it, to show their reasoning, bullet points, talking points. They don't have them.
So you've jumped to my next question, which is how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? And it sounds like you want them to talk more, and it sounds like you want them to talk more on the floor.
I do. Now, I'm going to put technology aside for the moment. I mean, we now have technology. We're doing it now. We are Zooming. Whether this or some comparable technology might be acceptable in future deliberations, maybe not. I'm a little biased against it because I think people should show up, be present. They should be present for votes. They should be present for debates. Yes, it will take more time. This is how this links to your earlier question about, yes, Congress might be in session much longer. Debates would last longer. The days would be longer. They'd all have to show up. Okay. I feel pretty strongly about that because I think it puts a burden of responsibility on members to actually stand up in the light of day, in the light of CANAAN, if you like, to make clear what they believe and to respond to challenges in real time. And I would hope that also that burden would elevate the level of language that's used in politics as well, which I think is pretty sad on the whole. And you know, I think that the way it's too easy at present, I think, for members to avoid taking responsibility for what they actually believe and think. It's contrary to both the founding principles and the practice of congressional practice through most of our history. I mean, it's frankly pathetic to see one member speaking to an empty floor. I also think that members who wish to vote to end or continue a filibuster have to show up. And now in the 19th century, where the filibuster was born, doesn't go back to the beginning. It's quite amusing and interesting to read, even in the Congressional Globe, forerunner of the Congressional Record of the time, how the sergeant at arms would have to go running around the Capitol building, not just to find absent members who were in the library or having I was going to say a hamburger, but they didn't eat hamburgers in those days, having a bite to eat in the snack bar, there was one, or to shake them awake because they were asleep on the benches on the couches rather at the back of the chambers, shake them awake. And this is all recorded because people were expected to be there. They knew it was their job to be there. And let us hear if this also asks members to look into themselves more and ask themselves why they believe what they believe and to try to persuade us, which very, very few members do today. I mean, they deliver talking points that are poll tested with the electorate back home or with stamped and approved by party leadership and so forth. I mean, even in my own party, I'm happy to see members diverge and speak their own mind, whether or not I actually agree with it, because I think it's good for democracy.
So it sounds like for the time question I posed, you'd want them to spend more time actually working in Congress and even physically on the floor. You like that notion. And then for the debate, deliberation, dialogue question, it also sounds like you want a revival of more everybody on the floor and there are debate going on there. Now, I've talked to other people who say a lot of that debate and all that discussion should happen in committee versus the floor. They've given up on the floor. So I'm curious what you have to say, floor versus committee room, where a lot of these debates can happen.
Well, okay. I think it should take place more in committee as well. I've sat in any number of committee hearings in Washington where 3 members show up.
Right.
3 members show up, and 2 of them are just reciting talking points. I mean, I don't think it's really necessarily happening there either. But yes, I do think it should. I do want to see it happen on the floor. Why? Because the public, the public, except in rare instances, is not watching committee hearings. In fact, they're not watching floor debate either, because there's really no debate on the floor. And I think that we have this marvelous arena that is the floor of Congress, or is the House or the Senate, which in theory at least, and certainly for the founders, and certainly through most of American history, brought together in one place, face to face, the men who represent, or now women, who represent all of us. And I think restoring that dramatic arena to the way it was more originally, something closer to what was originally conceived, frankly, would help elevate public interest in Congress. And the catastrophically low interest in and approval of Congress by the public is a national crisis. It's a national crisis. I think it's fundamentally unjustified, but it's rooted in no small part in the fact that comparatively few Americans, I think, today really appreciate how Congress works. And this gets into another area that has to do with public education, which I care a great deal about. And I think when I'm old enough to have actually gone through school, when there was something called civics and learning the machinery of government. You weren't expected to find it fun. It was just information like the multiplication and addition tables that had to be learned, because you couldn't be a citizen without knowing. And I think it's tragic, and worse than tragic actually, that civics education has dropped out of so many curricula around the country. But I think regenerating public understanding of Congress, its operation, and the process, the process of the legislating would go a long way toward I think improving the caliber of legislative government. People really knew more, followed it more closely, the broad public, rather than just interest groups, lobbying groups who have a vested interest in one aspect or another of it. I think it would partly elevate the standing of Congress, elevate our appreciation of government, reduce the danger of demagoguery, and putting members back on the floor in front of the public, and in a modern vein, trying to do what the founding generations and the following generations did on the floor of Congress would be a great benefit to the country. And if there's less time to do personal constituent service or campaign, well, look, our campaigns have become egregious. Other countries can stage a campaign within a couple of weeks. Britain, for example, we're in permanent campaign mode in this country, which gets into other areas having to do with fundraising and media and so on, which I think is beyond our purview today. But I think there's no real excuse for that, except it's the way we do it today. But that's not a justification for something that costs prodigious amounts of money and sucks up so much of legislators' time.
Well, my next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years? Maybe it's related to the campaigns. Where do you think the biggest thing is if you could make some change in 50 years?
Well, I just touched on one example, as you did. I think truncating campaigns would be a great step forward. Setting a maximum campaign period, whatever it might be, 3 months maybe. I just picked that number out of the air. It's not one I'm wedded to. But a permanent campaign is very costly to the country and to legislators. Structurally, we've also talked about talking filibuster and so on. And I mean, the biggest problem, the biggest conundrum, in my view, is the radical distortion in the U.S. Senate, which, as we said earlier, Madison thought should be a majority body. And it's so grossly out of sync with population. I mean, personally, I would not object to the Senate becoming a majority body. I don't foresee that, certainly in my lifetime. I mean, what senators are going to vote for the extinction of their own power? That's why it's a conundrum. This is not a simple problem to solve. It may not be solvable. Various ideas are advanced that Senate votes be weighted by population. Again, you always run into the same problem of what senators would liquidate their own power. I don't see that, but I think we have to be honest about how badly the distribution of power in the Senate distorts legislation. I mean, tiny states, and they're not all of one party either. You know, you have Wyoming, you also have Vermont. You know, I think it's utterly inexcusable from a logical and a democratic point of view that states with minuscule populations have equivalent Senate power in the Senate to a California or a Texas, for example, or a New York. And I think it's disingenuous to say, well, the founders knew what they were doing. Well, the country was extremely different in 1787 and 88, and first Congress began in 1789. The balance of power is radically different, and the disparity between the most populous state and the least was 13 to 1 in 1789, and it's 68 to 1 today. There's by no stretch is this reasonably representative or democratic. I put that out there because I think it skews the way legislation has to be done, taking into account senators who represent hardly anybody. And I underscore this is not inherently a partisan issue, because you have a highly, at present, may change, Democratic state, California, a highly Republican state, Texas, who suffer equally by that disparity, okay?
You could always split those states up. That's the other way to go.
More easily said than done. Neither of those giant states was originally conceived as being only one state. There were, if you were to read, as I have, the debates in the California Constitutional Convention back in 1849-50, the configuration of what is today California was proposed. All sorts of different configurations were proposed, and Texas was proposed as being divided into anywhere up to 6 states. 4 definitely. Nobody thought it was going to remain the size that it is, but there you go. I mean, it had to do with the politics of other eras. And again, I don't see either of those entities or any other state subdividing itself as logical as that might be.
So my next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform? That's how I typically put it, but maybe Congress generally speaking, if you'd rather talk on that.
Well, I will tell you that I was most influenced, I think, this has to do with the first Congress in particular, in shaping my thinking about what that Congress did and and how well it performed. The writing of Ken Bowling, Professor Kenneth Bowling of George Washington University. He's not a household name, but he's the preeminent scholar of the first Congress. And his own research was the foundation on which I did my own. He was also one of the 4 editors of the magnificent first Federal Congress project under the aegis of George Washington University in DC, which has existed for about 50 years and has as its brief the collection of every piece of writing that bore on the first Congress. And it was, again, it was part of the foundation of my own work, because every known letter by every member of the first Congress was collected in I think it's 22 volumes. I think in terms of, well, answering your question, I've read prodigiously, among people's writings, and if I cherry pick, I hesitate to cherry pick because, for each person I mention, other than Ken Bowling, there are 10 I should have mentioned. So I'm not going to go there, I think.
All right. Well, the last question is really about your future work. What do you have planned, and does any of it relate to Congress, or have you moved on to other subjects?
Well, I'm close to finishing a book about the federal war against the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s under Ulysses Grant. I'll have that finished this spring, and I hope it'll be out in 2023. A great deal of it's about Congress, although for the first time, I've actually written quite a bit about a president, Grant, obviously, who was the dynamo pushing for sending their army into the South to fight the Klan, and for vigorous prosecution by the Justice Department of the Klan in the South. I couldn't resist delving into the congressional debates of that era. It's primarily the 1868 to 74 period, when members of Congress debate how to deal with homegrown terrorism. The Klan has to be thought of as a homegrown terrorist movement, the first in American history, and some of the issues that have been debated in recent years were very much in the forefront then as well. Lingering problems of states' rights. Is it the responsibility of the federal government or the states to enforce civil rights? And in those days, states, the ideology of states' rights held that the federal government had no business whatsoever for enforcing the rights guaranteed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those were purely state responsibilities unless the transgression was committed by the state, but that the federal government had no power to interfere rather to act against the interference of rights by individuals. And this has been a long-standing argument in American history as well. The radicals who were for national enforcement of civil rights win the argument for a while, then they lose it. As long as the Republican radicals at the time continue to dominate Congress, as they do for a number of sessions, rights are enforced. Once they lose that argument and the Supreme Court begins overturning the civil rights legislation post-Civil War, the states' responsibility shifts back to the southern states, and they enforce nothing. So I'm writing about congressional debates that seem awfully contemporary in some respects.
Awesome. Well, Mr. Bordewich, thank you so much for the time. Good luck with your new projects, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure for me. I appreciate all your excellent questions.